Hey there, art nerds. If you celebrate the 4th of July, happy 4th of July. But even if you don't, this simple technique for fireworks is useful for any big celebration, whether it's Chinese New Year's, the birth of a child, or a graduation. I'm going to show you guys how to complete this illustration in just a few simple steps, but I do want you guys to keep in mind that this uses a lot of wet into wet technique. So while this is an easy tutorial, it may be a bit more time consuming. So you want to give yourself plenty of time. This tutorial started life as a live stream, so if you'd like the slower version of it, you can find it here on the channel, but this has been time-lapsed with all of the dry times removed for your convenience. So the materials you guys are going to need for today's tutorial are pretty simple. I'm painting on Cottonrag watercolor paper today. I'm using the Blick Studio watercolor block. It's an affordable Cottonrag paper that's block bound, so it's pre-stretched for you, and that's going to be really important today because we're going to be messing around with a lot of water. You also want some bright, vivid watercolors, neons, yellows, blues. This would be a great time to break out your pastels as well. You're also going to want some really dark watercolors, so blacks, indigos, navies, dark purples, that sort of thing. So I have here my Daily Driver palette and my Naomi palette. So these are two very different palettes that have a lot of very different colors. The Naomi palette is great because it includes a lot of bright neon and pastel colors. I've also got Daniel Smith's Lunar Black. This is a super granulating black color that's going to give us some texture and grit, but you don't need it. You're also going to need masking fluid. I prefer to use Winsor and Newton removable masking fluid, the kind with a little bit of yellow dye in it, and I put it in a small paint pot for ease of use. You're also going to want to have either some brush soap or some bar soap or some baby shampoo handy. You're going to use this to protect the synthetic watercolor brush that you're going to use to apply your masking fluid. Now, there are lots of different methods for applying masking fluid. This is just the masking fluid method that works well for me. You're also going to want some large watercolor brushes. They can be synthetics if that's what you like. I recommend a large mop, maybe a large hake brush, maybe some large rounds. I also have an inexpensive ceramic plate. I picked that up at Dollar Tree, and a masking frisket or a masking fluid removal tool. You can find those even down at Dollar Tree, and all they are is they help you remove the masking fluid once it's dry from your paper, and dry is going to be the key term here. I want to go ahead and apologize a bit for my framing. I was dual recording on both my phone and using my webcam, and sometimes it's difficult to get the best angle for both. So I'm starting out by drawing some simple circular shapes as well as the trailing fireworks trail. So guys, if you guys have ever watched fireworks, and I'm sure you have, you know how they kind of like use the rocket to get up there and then they explode, leaving a trail of light behind them. I'm also heavily referencing fireworks as I'm sketching this, and I apologize that you guys can't really see me sketching it. The graphite isn't picking up too well. You don't have to use graphite for this. You could use colored leads. You could even use something that has a little bit of a resist to watercolor if you want. But for this, I'm trying to capture the very basic form. So I'm kind of treating the watercolors the way I think about flowers, where I start out with a circle and I figure out where the center is, and then I have the different little explosions radiating off from the center. This is going to be a little difficult for me to talk about just because I don't have the correct terminology. So if you guys reference fireworks, and I highly recommend you do, because even if you think you know what they look like, sometimes you would be surprised by just the sheer diversity in types of fireworks and the way they explode and the kind of colors used. So I would recommend you reference that. And for this, I'm actually combining a few different fireworks explosions that I happen to like best. And I have three main explosions, and I've got some small like sparklers going off at the bottom. So for this illustration, I chose not to fill the whole thing. I'm keeping it pretty simple. You can do with yours whatever you like. This is just a guide to show you guys a very simple watercolor technique. I'm not one for like step by step by step, draw it like this and then draw it like this and then paint it like that, because I feel like that really stifles creativity. And I just want to give you guys kind of a guide for how I go about doing it, So that way you can let your own imagination run wild. I'm working on a larger watercolor block today. I think it's 10 by 14. That's easier for me to paint. It's also easier for the camera to capture, but this would make a really charming gift card or postcard. And you guys, if you've been watching for the channel for a really long time, you guys know I am a big proponent of simple drawing to make impactful cards. So next we are getting real wet into wet. So I have a cup of clean water here. Since I'm painting in Southeast Louisiana and it was pouring, it's the middle of hurricane season. Happy 4th of July, y'all. I have the fan on, I have the AC on, I have the dehumidifier on. And while people always mention hair dryers and heat guns, I have found that those really don't work well for me. I don't like the end results with those. They tend to just have negative effects on my art. So they're not really a tool that I enjoy, but they might be a tool that you enjoy and find beneficial. But I will warn you, if you're using masking fluid, you want to remove it. A heat gun or a hair dryer can actually cause it to permanently fuse to your paper, making it not removable. So that's one of the reasons I'm not really big on using hair dryers and heat guns in my watercolor, even though it really speeds up the process. So I've mixed up a few really bright colors, and I'm using this for my wet into wet underwash. And I figured it was so humid out there that my watercolors would stay nice and wet and open as I apply the colors, but I did find that some dried quicker than usual. So I'm going in with lots of bright colors. I've got neons, I've got hot pink, I've got bright orange, just whatever bright, fun colors you like. This would be a great time to break out those pastel watercolors that you might have been hoarding and not sure what to do with, because this is just you can do more layers with this technique, but the basic idea is really just a couple of layers. I'm also using some splatter techniques, wet into wet, so we get this really wild diffuse color, like the fireworks are all popping off and they're casting a lot of smoke, and I'm just trying to capture the energy and the excitement that you get from watching a live fireworks show. So I found that that area in the middle was a little too mannered, so I tried to drip in some really bright, intense water. Didn't do so well. You want to allow this to dry absolutely fully. So that's one of the reasons we're working on a block. It holds our watercolor nice and tight. You're not going to have any buckling. You're not going to have any kipping. Cottonrag paper can also take a lot more water than cellulose water, and it holds it into the fibers, which is going to allow us to do our later techniques a bit more successfully. So I have applied a lot of brush soap to my synthetic watercolor brush, and then I dip it in my masking fluid. And the brush soap helps protect the individual filaments, the individual hairs of your watercolor brush. It also helps prevent it from sucking all that masking fluid up into the metal ferrule, where you'll never be able to remove it ever again. And even though you guys can't see it, I'm trying to follow the pencil guidelines that I have down. They're pretty faint. They're actually kind of difficult for me to see. So I'm also referencing my reference, working along with that, but I'm also adding and I'm embellishing and I'm adding more details. And the masking fluid part of this, other than the dry times, might be the most time consuming part, because you're really doing the most painting with your masking fluid. So this is kind of a fun one because it's different from how I normally think of watercolors. Usually I'm painting with the watercolors, not using the watercolors to kind of create a negative and then using masking fluid for my painting. So this was a fun way to just kind of get out of my own head and try something new. And it's quite different from my usual watercolor style and my usual watercolor illustration. So I thought it would be a fun, more simple watercolor tutorial to share with you guys. If y'all are looking for more super easy step-by-step get you started watercolor tutorials, I've got you covered here on the channel. Over the years, I have made dozens of very simple, basic, help you get started watercolor tutorials, as well as many more complicated, more nuanced, require a little more experience and more skill watercolor tutorials. I'm a watercolor comic artist. I paint the comic 7-inch Kara. I hope you guys will check it out at 7inchkara.com. You can read it for free as a webcomic, or you can purchase volume 1 and volume 2 from my shop. And whenever you buy something from my store, it does help support the work that I do as a comic artist, as well as the work that I do here on the channel. So now that I've got my basic masking fluid blocked in, I'm using a splatter and flicking technique. At first, first I was just tapping the brush against my hand, but I wanted some more directed splatters, so I went in and just kind of flicked it with my fingers. Now, I have a latex allergy, so I try to avoid that technique when possible, and you could use a toothbrush for that. You could use a stiffer bristle brush for that. It's really whatever you like. So you want to let your masking fluid dry completely before you apply your next layer of watercolor. That's going to help it remove more successfully. And I'm going in now with dark blues, with indigos, with undersea green, with purples, with dark reds, with Payne's gray, even with a little bit of black. And I'm starting to block in my sky so that we can get that firework glow effect. I'm also applying a little bit of that to the centers of our explosions and then blending it out a bit. I'm sprinkling in a little bit of kosher salt here because I wanted to get a little bit of diffusion. So the way kosher salt works is it actually pushes the water away and it can create little salt rings, which makes for an interesting texture and technique. And I thought that would kind of add to like the smoky effect going on with the watercolor here. So in the live stream, we were having so much problem, so much difficulty. The dry times were just really, really long, and that's one of the downsides of doing watercolor live is there's often a lot of just sitting and watching paint dry. So we opted to end the stream, and this is where I finished the tutorial on my own since I promised to share it with you guys. So after my black paint dried and I removed all of the salt, I used a brush, but I also scraped a lot of it off by hand. I'm going back in with the masking fluid and creating a second layer of mask. We're going to do another layer of darker colors and black on top of that. And this is going to help us reserve some areas. It's going to help us create some depth. So I'm adding in some finer, more nuanced explosion lines. Now I'm really painting with the masking fluid. I actually had a lot of fun with this, and I think I'd like to try this technique maybe for painting water or for trying other things. So I'm not just flicking, I'm also using really fine brush strokes to try and achieve the effect that I want. So masking fluid can be really tricky. I know I've struggled with different brands and different techniques over the years. This is the technique that works for me. It might not work so well for you. It's always a your mileage may vary situation, but I find that letting the masking fluid dry completely and also allowing the paper to dry completely in between layers helps for more successful use and more successful removal. So once that dried, I'm going in with a lot of black mixed in with our Lunar Black, and I'm also kind of blending it out using some clean water. So this is one of the reasons we worked on Cottonrag paper today, is that it can really take all the layering, it can take all the blending without turning to total mud. If I'd painted on a cheaper cellulose paper for this technique, it wouldn't have been nearly as successful. We wouldn't have been able to do as much wet into wet. We wouldn't have been able to do as much layering because it would have started to fall apart. So I'm painting around my fireworks and then using clean water to kind of blend it into the fireworks, creating a sense of glow. And this is one of those illustrations that if the humidity had been right, it would have been really easy to do and it would have been easy to achieve the effects that I wanted. But humidity can play a huge part in your watercolor work, your success as a watercolor artist, and what techniques you can use. And I feel like it's something that just isn't talked about enough, possibly because a lot of my other watercolor friends live in less humid, cooler environments. So they're not struggling against the humidity as much as I am, but I know a lot of watercolor artists who also paint in really humid environments, and we don't really talk about the struggles a whole lot, I feel like, because maybe we think we should be able to overcome them. But it's definitely there, and it can affect your art. So I'm going in now with some of my really bright, bold colors while everything's still wet. These are colors that tend to have some opacity to them. So if you have pastel watercolors or watercolors with a lot of optical brighteners, this could be a great chance to kind of flick them in because they can kind of stand up to the black and the darker colors. If you have some gouache, this could also be a great opportunity for you to introduce some yellow, some red, some blue, and really get those pops of color. So once everything has dried, the paper and the masking fluid, I'm using a masking fluid pickup to remove my masking fluid. I'm trying to be very careful about it because there's a lot of masking fluid on the page. I have a lot of little speckles, a lot of little dots, and I want to make sure I get all of it. So even though this looks like I'm working super duper fast, it actually took me 30 minutes to remove all the masking fluid. I'm using my finger to kind of feel and see if there's any areas I miss. And I also go back over the whole piece and just kind of gently rub the masking fluid pickup against the paper to pick up any stray masking fluid once I've picked up the bulk of the masking fluid. So some artists can use their fingers to pick up masking fluid. My hands are super dry, so that doesn't work so well for me. And I find that the masking fluid pickup just has the best results. It doesn't really tear the paper. It doesn't really rip the paper. It doesn't pick up the paint, but you do want to remove those masking fluid boogers from the side of your masking fluid pickup for, best results for most efficacious removal of your masking fluid. So I'm working top to bottom. You can work however you like, but it does help to kind of pick an area and work your way out from there. It just helps you remember. And you could totally be done now. This looks great. You could totally be finished with this illustration now if you are satisfied with it. But you guys know me. I love overworking things. I love making things more difficult than they have to be. So I'm going to continue to work it just a little bit because while it's really pretty good and I'm pretty happy with it, it's not 100% where I want it to be just yet. So now I want to flick in some more color. Some of the removal is a little too neon, a little too glowing, a little too striking for me. So I want to soften it up a bit. So I'm going to splatter some paint in. I've got some really opaque pastels that I'm splattering in. I want to also kind of add in some more of my oranges, and I want to kind of bring those colors throughout the piece. I'm also going to spray these with a water bottle, and my water bottle had a little bit of a malfunction, so it tended to just dump the water on the paper. But I also sprayed it just to kind of get those colors to diffuse, to get them to move around. And that's one of the real joys of Cottonrag paper. If I had been painting on cellulose, this would be a total mess. It would basically be sloughing off the paper. And I use cellulose paper all the time, but the true key to using this quote-unquote student grade paper is knowing how to use it and having watercolor experience. Whereas Cottonrag, while it's more expensive and it might seem a little more intimidating, is great because it's honestly less temperamental and it can be easier to use, and it's definitely more forgiving. I also wanted to kind of soften the rocket flares a little bit because they are very pronounced right now. So I'm brushing in some purple, some red, some green at the base, and then blending it out and spritzing it with the watercolor just to kind of get some more color in there and to diffuse it. So if you want to, way back in the early stages when we did our overall wet into wet wash of different colors, you can mask that off and then do an even brighter, more saturated wash of colors at that stage, and then mask that off as well, and then add your black. So what's cool about this technique is you can do as many layers as you want to. You can get as nuanced as you want to. You can keep it really simple, fun, and graphic, and just do 2 layers, your initial color wash, mask that off, and then do your black layer, and then you're done. You can do multiple layers and really try to build up those colors and build up that atmospheric perspective and try to make it more realistic. But that's what I love about like a good watercolor technique, is you can take it as far as you want to take it. So I'm using a little bit of white gouache just to kind of help delineate some of those flares. They got kind of lost in there. So I did just like a little swirl of white gouache, and then I'm spraying it with water to get it to just kind of diffuse onto the paper. I'm also flicking some white gouache, not a whole lot, but just a little bit, to kind of capture that super white, super bright, super hot, like the sparkler effect. And we are just about finished. All that's left is to remove this from its block. The Blick Studio block did a great job holding this paper taut. I didn't have any buckling issues. I didn't have any bending issues. I don't have any warping issues. So this was a great way to very quickly, theoretically, paint a watercolor illustration because it holds it in place for you. The humidity did play a huge factor. I had my AC cranked down. I had my dehumidifier. I have a whole house dehumidifier running. I had my fan on. Joseph suggested we build a desiccator box and use that to help draw the moisture out. So that's a project I can't wait to try out with you guys, and we'll see if it actually works because, you know, I got to represent for my other artists painting in high humidity areas. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope this inspired you. It's really pretty easy. You can use whatever colors you want. You could go red, white, and blue if you want. You could go with a selected color scheme. I wanted to really capture the magic of fireworks, like at Disney World, where you get all these different bright, beautiful colors. You get greens, you get purples, you get reds, you get blues, you get pinks, you get oranges, and I wanted to capture that with this today. So now we're going to remove it from our block. This is super simple. You just slip a palette knife into the opening and you just work your way around the block. For years I used to use an X-Acto blade to try and cut it off because no one showed me this, and it's so easy. So there is no reason to cut yourself in it with an X-Acto blade trying to remove your watercolor illustration from its block. A palette knife works just fine. So I want to thank you guys for joining me today. I hope this was inspiring for you. I double want to thank you if you hung out with me during the live stream and put up with those crazy long dry times. You guys really mean a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. And I want to wish you guys a happy 4th if you celebrate the 4th. This tutorial was made possible thanks to the generosity of my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for your support over the years. I really appreciate it.